Okay, great. Well, it's 10 o'clock, at least here in London. Far later in other parts of the world, Australia, far earlier in the Americas. So welcome to this this meeting at Stockholm, or CB World Water Week 2021 on transformative water governance for resilient and fair societies. I'm very pleased to be hosting this session and excited that we're convening with the Stockholm Environment Institute this meeting at a time where I think a lot of attention is now focusing on an upcoming global UN conference on water in 2023. In 1977, it's a long way back now, 40-something years, UN held its first global water conference, and the outcome of that conference didn't make mention of water governance. I'm pretty sure the upcoming conference in 2023 will, which is a measure of how important the issues have become. So I'm really happy to invite all of you to this meeting. We have an action-packed hour ahead of us. We will have a very short introduction from the Director General of IMI, Dr. Mark Smith, very shortly, followed by some opening thoughts from myself to help frame the idea and the positioning of transformative water governance in the wider space around water governance and development and systems transformation, followed by three really important case studies that ground these ideas in different geographies. And we'll be bringing case studies from Southeast Asia and from Southern Africa. So really important that we ground the ideas in some of the lived experience in these regions. So I'd like to invite Mark to provide your opening remarks, and then I will go into my short introduction. Over to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Alan. Yeah, greetings from Montreal, where I'm sitting. So from me, it's good morning, but good afternoon or good evening to depending on wherever you are. Yeah, it really is a pleasure on behalf of IMI to welcome everyone to what I expect is going to be an hour of reflections and debate on the state of water governance. You know, there are two cliches, or maybe truisms, if we're being kind to ourselves, of the water agenda that I'm sure are on full display at Stockholm Water Week this year. First, that water crisis is a crisis of water governance, and that to meet the imperatives of water security, SDG 6, resilience, saving biodiversity, and we know the list goes on, that systems must transform. And of course, there's a lot to unpack in those two statements, and each is a prime motivation for participants to join the deliberations in Water Week, we know that. But taken together, they also beg the asking of vital new questions that this session will start to address. So what water governance will catalyze, facilitate, and mobilize the forces of systemic change? And how will we make sure that this is inclusive and fair? So what, therefore, is transformative water governance? Now, where should this conversation start? First, current policy dialogue and analysis needs to recognize the complex nature of the water system and how intrinsic to this system, water governance is contested by various interests and power relations. So as a basic premise then, having everyone on board for inclusive decision-making will be key in transformative water governance, because amongst the complexity of the water system, what is perceived as a solution by some can in fact be viewed, of course, as a problem by others. So in the context then of thinking through transformation, lack of inclusion therefore blocks both fairness and sets up barriers to change, barriers to those transformations. So as a starting point then for today's discussion, we can say that transformative water governance will be complexity aware and inclusive of contestation by multiple interests. So our aim is to open dialogue from this basic starting point on what might be the guideposts and principles for transformative water governance using learning from experience and results from research on water governance. We're going to hear, as Alan just said, we're going to hear from case studies from IMI's work and our partners in the SUMERNET program led by SEI Bangkok, and use those to look further into what I see as three key considerations for how governance can be effective as an engine for transformation and change. First, we'll unpack how power struggles and power relations shape and reshape the emergence of new political spaces and institutions that are needed for resilient, just, and inclusive development. Second, we'll look for evidence to illustrate how local communities and other non-conventional actors in water governance use political spaces to engage in and catalyze change, and how this uses both formal and informal processes and articulates with higher levels of multi-level governance. And third, lessons in how principles for catalyzing and managing change in complex settings, systems can be woven through the policy and institutions of water governance. So we hope then that participants will come away from the session motivated to continue a dialogue on how water governance can meet the deepening needs that we face, the deepening needs that we're confronting for systems transformation. I'm grateful to our partners, SEI, for their partnership in collaboration today, in today's session, and more broadly on building inclusive water governance. And I'm looking forward to listening and learning from the case studies and discussions. And I wish everyone a really good and enjoyable session. So thank you, and back to you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Mark. Very important points and very important reflections there in helping to kick off this discussion. I wanted to just encourage everyone as we go along to put your questions and thoughts into the chat, and you should find that in the CB World Water Week page related to this this particular session. But also, if you feel an urgent need to speak, raise your hand so that we can identify a range of inputs towards the end as we get towards the discussion, and hopefully cover as many of those people that want to interject as possible. Keep them short if you can, and direct them as specifically as you can to particular speakers. So framing some of this then, thinking about these political spaces of engagement and transformative water governance, you know, we're really here talking about political power and contestation as a key element in change, in transformation, in a sense, bringing to the fore in water governance those contestations Mark mentions, and recognizing that change, particularly fundamental change in systems, is really a process of contestation. And someone once said, I think development is essentially very long wave conflict, and that is understanding these changes from a political perspective and thinking through what that means for water governance, which is often framed in quite technocratic terms, not deliberately, but perhaps inadvertently, through the focus on water as a resource, rather than the focus more on the people, or the agents of change, the actors, stakeholders involved in making those changes. So the way that we're framing this notion of transformative water governance is very much actor oriented and actor focused, understanding how those struggles between different communities, within communities indeed, over power resources and changes within water governance systems will affect outcomes, will be essentially building blocks for transformative change, becoming very important elements in achieving, for example, SDG targets. And we often talk in the water sector, and you will have heard this week in many sessions, reference to the SDG 6, but also all the other SDGs having fundamental elements of water systems transformation within them. So, you know, we're saying here that not just is water governance a human-centric systems issue, but it's also intrinsic to change across a whole range of different systems. So in that sense, you know, transformative water governance is a water governance that can help shift major structural changes in other systems, whether they're food systems, land, or climate systems indeed. So understanding those kind of transformative elements is absolutely essential in perhaps reframing the way we think about water governance. But central to that is the idea of people as agents of change in their own development transformation. So we'll find out, we'll hear from those 3 case studies more about that. What does this mean? Essentially, it's embedding power relations within our understanding of water governance here, and thinking through those more normative elements of water governance. Many of you will know the OECD 12 water governance principles, of course, that are very useful. And the last 3 are approaching some of these elements of transformative water governance. We're hoping to take that a little bit further. Maybe there's a need for a 13th water governance principle focused specifically on issues of equity and justice, because these are fundamental elements of the development landscape. And within that are these structural changes in power relations that we witness globally every day: contestations over inequalities, contestations over access to resources. So in this idea of transformative water governance, those structural changes in power relations necessary to make those shifts towards more equitable and sustainable environments and development pathways is essential. And part of that process of systems transformation change will involve those changes in power relations. And those are what we are foregrounding, as I said at the beginning, within this notion of transformative water governance. And there are some really interesting pieces out there. There's one on Aboriginal communities in Australia, looking at the impacts of kind of existing water governance arrangements and the challenges of those arrangements on, as Mark said at the beginning, the impacts of one person's choice of systems on other people's systems, and how that can be changed through rethinking the nature of water governance from a people-centric perspective. So again, it's not so much revolutionary, but certainly evolutionary with a real attempt at structural change at its heart. And as an example, there's an urban sprawl in Addis Ababa where there's a major contestation over parts of rural urban spaces, development of an urban center encroaching into farmland, encroaching into areas of a particular basin, the Incomati basin, where there are challenges and contestations over resource access and a very fragmented governance environment. So again, the nature of collective action and building responsibility and capacity into local communities to take charge of their resources, to empower themselves to bring change at a local level over the governance of resources is really critical at these kind of urban rural interfaces. So it's not just about kind of big picture river basin relationships, it's also about those sort of more micro connections between communities across these spaces. So as we go forward and we examine these case studies, some key questions: what are those drivers shaping local communities and other stakeholders' abilities or inabilities indeed to shape power dynamics and relations in water governance at different scales? How does this process of contestation or even lack of result in types and forms of political spaces and engagement and institutional emergence? And what does this contribute to reshaping transformative change processes from all the different levels, individual up to institutional, societal levels? And what are those implications, therefore, for achievement of key development goals? So with those thoughts in mind, I'd now like to turn over to Diana to bring us a really interesting case study from Daula Lake in Myanmar. Diana, over to you.
Thank you, Alan. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Diana Swadiman. I'm a senior researcher at the International Water Management Institute based in Vientiane, Laos. So today I will present a case study of Daula Lake in Myanmar. The case study itself will illustrate how local community creates political spaces of engagement through inter-village level strategic alliances, and how these insights actually could also further our understanding of transformative water governance. So this is a picture of Daula Lake in Myanmar. How can I... Yes, so the lake is home to 8,000 people living in the 5 villages surrounding the lake: Mikayin, Motkadi, Kedo, Kankalai, and Kanchi. Daula Lake is a seasonally river-fed wetlands complex located on the western bank of the Salween River in Karen State, Myanmar. This map gives an overview of the lake water body during the rainy and the dry seasons. So in the rainy seasons, the Salween River flows increases and it flows into the lake area and transforming farmers' agriculture land and water bodies to the fishing ground. And the opposite happened during the dry seasons when the water flows out from the lake and transforming the fishing ground back to the farmers' agriculture land to plant paddy, vegetable, and use the adjacent field for livestock grazing. And this table next to the map gives an overview of the number of households in each of the 5 villages in the Daula Lake, together also with the main livelihood options and farming strategies for each village. So now going to the freshwater law. According to the freshwater law of 2014, the state government distinguishes 2 different types of lake management. The first one is the lease lake for the country's economic development, and the second one is the reserve lake for environmental conservations. In current state, there are in total 34 lakes, with Daula Lake as the only lake that has not yet listed as a lease lake. So the way the lake management has been contested by its key stakeholders is most apparent from the ongoing power struggle surrounding the formal management status of the lake. Despite the fact that the lake is not yet listed as a lease lake, the state government, together with private developers, would from time to time propose various plans with regard to the lake management. So this way, the formal management status of the lake can be changed from reserve to lease lake, depending on whether or not villagers would object the proposed development plan. So in 2014, for example, village heads from Mikayin and Kankalai villages saw the state government's advertisements to privatize the lake during their general meeting in the General Administrative Department in Pa'an City. So after they saw these advertisements, both village heads quickly informed other village heads and villagers and arranged a meeting to discuss the best way forward to stop the proposed development. They gathered that legally and procedurally, the state government has to follow all the steps outlined in the freshwater law of 2014, including informing villagers and get their prior consent. So referring to these legal procedures, all village heads agreed to draft and submit the objection letter together with a petition letter signed by villagers. And following the submission of the objection letter, the state government decided to halt the plan. So this process played an important role in shaping both village heads' ideas to come with inter-village lake management committee and organizations as a means to ensure that villagers as well as village authorities have a say in the way the lake is actually managed, or even in the terms of its management planning. So the interim committee for Daula Lake management is set up in respectively Mikayin and Kankalai village in 2016 and 2017. And the inter-village interim committee body is later set up in early 2018, incorporating all the 5 villages. So in practice, however, managing a lake at the inter-village level requires also a certain level of collective action, both to ensure inclusive lake management and also with regard to coming up with a mechanism for conflict resolutions that are fair and acceptable for everyone. So for this reason, we work together with local communities and current environmental and social action network in Myanmar, Kesan, to develop this board game that we call Rural Wetlands. So in this board game, players assume their role either as one of the 4 villages. You can see these villages in the screen as this as the fruits. I think mangosteen, pomegranate, pineapple, and I can't see papaya, I think, which each depend on the wetlands for their livelihoods, or as one of the 4 government departments with each having their own development targets. So the whole essence of developing this board game is to kind of play out scenarios and dilemmas happening in the real life while facilitating negotiation processes to be fair and inclusive. So it offers 8 roles to be filled in the board games. Development practitioners, government officials, local communities, CSO, academics, youth groups, and village elders can all join and play the game. And the main idea or the main aim to develop the game together with local communities and key stakeholders is mostly to equip key stakeholders with insights that would facilitate future decision making. And last but not least, we would like also to illustrate that in a landscape's natural resource management context, there is never a one solution fits all or a single label for a local community. Thank you for your kind attention. I will
Thank you, Diana.
give the floor back to Ellen.
Yes, thank you very much, Diana. That was really useful. I wonder whether you just could comment. A question was posed in the chat, right? A general question, but it may apply to some extent to your case study, which is that, in this context, how far does water governance require government supervision? So it's the notion of governance is well understood. I mean, how far do we sort of tie governance to government, or how do we distinguish the two?
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, I think in the current situation of, heightened complexity, not only in the context of conflict resolution, but also in the context of climate change and changing political, socio-ecological system, I think we should do our best as to not come into a polarization of what is government, what is non-government, what is formal, what is informal. I think we should rather look at it as a puzzle that everyone needs to get their contribution on board to solve the puzzle together, because I think it is clear from our experiences, from our field research everywhere in the world, that not a single actor can solve the issue. I think everyone needs to put their contribution and their buy-in on the table.
So in using your game ruler, would you say that helps break down those kind of distinctions and barriers? It makes everyone a game player rather than a representative.
I think so the role of the game is actually to kind of create an equal playing field, because we know in reality the power asymmetry and the power relations can come in very strongly, even when you conduct a multiple stakeholder platform or a kind of like inclusive decision-making setup. If you invite local communities and if you invite the national governments, provincial district governments, that power relations still exists, right? And I think the idea of rule of the board game is to not ignore that power relations, to recognize it, and to find a way together how we can address it in a more fair and inclusive way.
Okay, and lastly, there's a question from Antoinette about the plan having been rejected for the lake. So do the villagers have the financial capacity to protect and manage the lake themselves? Will they have to pay a fee to the government? How will that work?
No, as long as the villagers as long as the villagers can retain the status of the lake as a reserve lake, then they do not have to pay any financial compensation or obligation to the government. But of course, the danger lurks in the fact that when state government or private developers negotiate only with 1 or 2 of the 5 villages, and these 1 or 2 villages agreed upon the plan, of course, it will affect the entire 5 villages. And I think that comes again, the importance of having this collective action at the lake management level, where all 5 villages come together and realize that they have to stand together.
Great, thanks. And there's another question in the chat. If you can have a look and answer directly, I'm going to move on now to, thank you, Diana. I'll move on now to Jonathan and your case study from the Incomati. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Alan. While I'm sharing screen, I'll just make a short note that the first question you raised about the difference between governance and government. It reminded me, my first project at EMI was on water governance in the Middle East. And I think in Arabic, there was the same word between governance and government. So we struggled to work around that to differentiate the two words. Okay, I am Jonathan Lautzi from the International Water Management Institute, and I'm going to present today the experience of the Incomati, water governance in the Incomati. And this was a presentation put together by myself and my colleague, Tendai Sawunyama from the Incomati Usutu Catchment Management Agency in South Africa. So when Diana asked me to give an example or talk about an experience of transformative, transboundary water governance in Africa, I started to think, and I think we had a nice brainstorm on that. So just to give people a very snippet of background, there's a lot of transboundary waters in Africa, a lot of transboundary cooperative water frameworks in Africa. You see the note there on your screen, all but 3 basins larger than 100,000 square kilometers have agreements. Nonetheless, it's often called soft. While there's been a lot of positive progress, some people could argue it lacks teeth. And by teeth, we typically mean allocation. So when we were thinking of a nice example to present on today, the Incomati, which is a basin I'll explain on the next slide in Southern Africa, we thought provided a nice example of water governance that has led to management allocation. So where is this Incomati? So it's a small basin. You'll see there 47,000 square kilometers, not particularly large. It's in the eastern part of South Africa, and it flows out to the Indian Ocean via Mozambique. And Eswatini, which was formerly called Swaziland, also has a piece of this basin. So on the map you see on the right of your screen, there's actually 3 basins which are often lumped together, but it's the northernmost of those 3, starting at the green, and it flows up and to the right there out and drains through Mozambique to the Indian Ocean. So in terms of the water governance history of this relatively small basin, so first off, there's been a lot. So as you see there, the legal and institutional environment, on the left, most of those deal with the entire basin of the Incomati. Particularly a few I'll highlight on the kind of bottom left of your screen. There's the agreement to create a tripartite permanent technical committee, a TPTC, between the 3 countries that share it in '83, and then there's a Pikes Peak agreement in '91. And then the one at the bottom is actually probably the most significant, an interim Incomati agreement, which was concluded in 2002. The one just above the bottom is a broader regional agreement, which had some influence, but not specific to the Incomati. To reinforce just how much activity there's been on the Incomati, I haven't even gotten into the right side of your screen. On the right side of your screen is a set of agreements dealing with a specific sub-basin in this basin. So the Incomati is a small basin. There's an even smaller basin within it called the Komati, which is shared only by 2 of the 3 countries. There's been a range of activity on that to create a joint water commission, a set of agreements associated with that as well. So quite a lot of institutional activity. To dig into just briefly some of the drivers, some of the motivators for all of this. So at a basic level, just from top to bottom there, hydrology and climate. So you have a lot of water resource development in there. More than 50% of water is utilized now. So this growing scarcity, contrary to what some may assert, actually leads often to to cooperation, not conflict. And so that drove a lot of the cooperation that happened in the Incomati. Like a lot of other places in the world and a lot of other places in Africa, there's high variability in rainfall and thus high variability in water availability. So then this drove a need to work together. So in '83, there was the TPTC that was formed to begin coordination on this in response to no river flow entering the downstream country Mozambique. In '91, there was a drive to water resource develop more. And then there was a requirement by the World Bank to receive a no objection from a downstream neighbor, which then drove, the World Bank was funding a dam in the upstream country, Swaziland. This led to negotiation and then agreement on a constant flow downstream, which was a very basic way of cooperating and agreeing on allocation. And then basically in 2002, that's when there was a much broader cooperative framework agreed to. As some of this was informed, there was an agreement, I think I highlighted a slide or two back. There was a static water sharing protocol. This helped guide the need for a more comprehensive approach to shared water management. And, I read highlighted at the bottom there, those words, low assurance, high assurance. So more directly to the point of this session today, those words are key because this broader allocation framework agreed that countries should prioritize certain high assurance water uses, like ecological flows, like domestic water use, and low assurance was things like irrigation, which you could compromise in years of water scarcity. Looking back at the title of this session, I think the words equity and resilience are pretty prominent. Right there, that's a step towards equity. Kind of ensuring all three countries utilizing the shared water course have a high assurance on what's most essential, which is domestic and environmental water uses. To get into the political spaces, which is ultimately the governance structure through which water is managed in Incomati. So you have the three countries there, South Africa, Swaziland, now Eswatini, Mozambique. So they give inputs via this TPTC, which is tripartite and includes all three countries. You'll see there at the right of this screen, there's equally a joint water commission because one of the major tributaries, in relative terms at least, it's major. One of the major tributaries is shared by just two countries, and then they have their own joint water commission. So that inputs to the TPTC. And then there's a particular basin water authority, the COBWA, which manages that. And then into the COBWA, you'll see there's various inputs which give an opportunity for stakeholders to input there. And then that goes up to the TPTC. You also see something there just below TPTC called ISOTG, which is an effort to coordinate systems operations in the basin, which is kind of like code for dam operations. That's at a transboundary level. I wanted to give an idea also, I think particularly this kind of speaks to the focus of this session. How do national concerns channel their inputs up into the transboundary level for coordinated management of this shared water course? So this is an example from South Africa, which is again just one of the three countries sharing this water course. So, it might be a bit overwhelming when you look at the left side of your screen, but I think the takeaway message is there's actually channels, conduits, avenues, whatever, for a lot of key organizations, stakeholders, government institutions, water management institutions, various catchment management forums to give their inputs via the IUCMA, this broader catchment management organization on the South African side, up to the DWS, Department of Water Sanitation, for management of the transboundary resource. There's also, if you just have a quick look at the right side of your screen, quite a range of stakeholder engagement activities to foster interactions and inputs from stakeholders at a range of level in the basin. Yeah, okay, and then again, pushing towards some of the overarching points that this session was intended to focus on, governance for equity and resilience. So has this helped to achieve that? I would argue yes. So I would say basically the journey of cooperative governance among these three countries has led to more management of the basin. I intentionally didn't put a word before management there because I think in a simple terms, there's more management. There's active management of this basin, which in itself is positive. And then the management has substance. There's allocation across countries, and no doubt it contains imperfections. But basically, two key things that it couples: there's a good amount of governance, a good amount of inclusion, a good amount of channels for stakeholders on different sides to input their preferences up. And then equally, there's actually substantive allocation rules, which which may come as a surprise to some people, but you don't always find in transboundary water management frameworks. So there's substantive water allocation rules. They balance water distribution across uses, which I flagged before. There's priority to domestic and ecology in times of scarcity. And then it also considers the variability issue, meaning, there's provision made to satisfy priority uses when there's insufficient water available to satisfy all uses. Final slide, just looking forward and thinking about the Incomati in context. We can't escape climate change, and I think there's the Incomati has not. So there's growing recognition that mean flows are changing. So the allocations that were agreed to were based on a mean flow, which is evolving. So that needs to be revisited. Variability may also increase. So there's a move towards rethinking this O2 agreement. And then there's also a drive towards a secretariat-based river basin organization, which is something you find in a lot of the African shared river basins. On the right of your screen, you'll see the kind of tentative structure for that. And I should say that drive is actually pretty far along. I think that the RBO is supposed to come into effect something like next year. And then to step back just briefly at the very end of this to consider the Incomati in context. One of the things that's often flagged, interestingly, is that there's a lot of substantive interaction in the Incomati. There's a pretty solid allocation framework. And it has been achieved to date without a conventional secretariat-based RBO. And what some people would point out is a lot of other river basins with a secretariat-based RBO have failed to achieve this level of sort of stakeholder involvement and this level of allocation strength. So that's quite a positive thing for the Incomati. And I think when we're thinking about a case study to present here, that made this one stand out. I'll close just leaving our two email addresses, and then I just wanted to flag in just a couple seconds that we have a case study on the Incomati. I say we, but it's the IUCMA led by Tendai and myself. We have a case study coming out in that's going to be featured in this UNEC handbook on water allocation and transboundary context, which I think is supposed to be published next month. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Really, really interesting case study there from Southern Africa in the Incomati Basin. Over now to Leonie Pearson from SUMERNET with your case study. I hope you can share your screen. And whilst you do, let me invite everyone to continue getting your questions into the chat and or raise your hand if you wish to speak, and we'll bring you in. Leonie.
Hi, can you hear me now? I seem to have lost my video. Just give me.
Oh, we can see the screen and we can hear you.
Excellent. Great. Well, then we should get started. So I want to take us on a sidewards journey here. I mean, basically, I think we've been hearing some great examples of on-ground research that's really focused on what water governance is and where and how it could be transformative to be more inclusive. I'd like to take us down a different track. The fact is that a lot of water governance is researched and understood through the funding models that we have. And here I want to share with you a new funding model, something that actually demands that we get a more inclusive outcome from our water governance from the beginning. And this funding is coming through the water research program called SUMERNET, which is the Sustainable Mekong Research Network. And that is funded through CEDA, and it's provided a 5-year funding window for research projects across the Mekong. Being a little bit facetious here, I'd just like to say that generally when we talk about water governance across all of our case study areas, we look at pictures like this, and we have a diversity of genders, ages, cultures, and we really feel like we're connecting in with the communities in which that we're engaging on the ground. But the reality is, and this comes to the first question that was there, that actually a lot of water research is not particularly inclusive of development, and it's more about water government than water governance. Now, I full-heartedly support Diana's response to that question, which is about that there is not only one person here in our water governance situation that needs to be engaged. We want community, we want civil service organisations, we want private business to be part of the solutions for our future and our current water challenges. And when we talk about who our researchers are and the type of work that they're doing across the Mekong, we find that there's an enormous diversity of the sorts of projects and ideas and concepts that they have. And the SUMERNET program has tried to actually work with our research to ensure that they're thinking about inclusiveness from the beginning, from the design of their programs. So I guess when we think about this, we're talking about a research program that has funded 14 research projects with multi-country situations or case studies across the Mekong, so including from Myanmar to Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and with some coordinators in China. An important element of this program is that it's actually got a steering committee which is from the researchers themselves. So it's a self-directed committee that they identify what they think is a priority for funding. That funding at the moment is around water insecurity. Here we've got two examples from some of our projects that are happening in Vietnam and in Laos. But let me share with you why this program is somewhat different, and I think why this program is helping us deliver on the aspirations of transformative water governance. Now, here in the middle, I have our two researchers. They're usually the sorts of people that put in for the funding over the long term, 2 to 3 year projects. But for success in the SUMERNET project, you actually need to be partnering with your what we call boundary partners. These are our people with small people or grey people or green people, and they're all about partnering with the other members, that governance concept. So it could be policymakers, it could be civil society organisations, community groups, we've got a youth network, we've got lots of women's networks. But what this happens at the early stage of the project, this project is ideally co-designed with both the researchers and our boundary partners working together to identify what the problem is, what the solutions are, and ensuring that our science is bridging from pure science to science and policy so that we're actually getting on-ground action as well. As I mentioned, the projects are around water insecurity, and it is a research project. There needs to be research outcomes that come from this. But additionally, what you will also find is that success in SUMERNET does not come unless all of these projects address 4 fundamental elements of inclusiveness. They have to have a human rights-based approach. They need to have conflict sensitivity. There needs to be gender inclusivity, and there needs to be an attribute of poverty reduction. Now, it's really unusual for water research projects to actually be required to address all of these elements. And I think this is where the real innovation comes. And this is where we're hoping that we're going to be driving change in the sorts of solutions that we're going to be seeing into the future of water governance. Because if from the beginning you're requiring research projects to actually think about inclusivity, not purely about how can we grow more frogs in our Lao uplands so that they can have a higher protein for the community, which is a locally driven issue, but actually, how do we do that so we're addressing issues about conflict sensitivity? So we're ensuring that gender is an attribute that we're looking at from the beginning of the design of the project. So we can make sure that we've addressed these issues, not perfect, but certainly a large step forward from where previous research, which did not have to address any of these elements. The final attribute that all of the projects need to address is not only our single water sustainable development goal, but it's actually a request for all projects to identify which other SDG they might be targeting. So it could be around gender, 5, or perhaps it's climate change, as was mentioned in previous examples. So here, what I wanted to share with you is the fact that transformative water governance can actually come in many different forms. And we're hoping here at the SUMERNET program, which is supported by SEI in its secretariat role, but funded by SIDA, the Swedish International Development Agency, is a new way of actually dealing with our researchers to ensure that we're delivering on more than just water governance in a more traditional sense. So the illustration that I've tried to provide is really about that water governance happens throughout the water industry, through its projects, through its research, through its infrastructure. And here we want to share something about how our research projects can drive innovative thinking and differences into the long term. We see that the projects are all delivering a resilient, just and inclusive development for the on-ground actions that they're desiring in the long term, and that we're actually designing this into the beginning of these projects. And we're also looking at water governance structures. So we're really, there's a whole diversity of research projects that we have. As I mentioned, there's 13 at the moment, there's 3 more coming on board. We also have a variety of smaller projects that are trying to develop more target-specific policy issues, but they deal with issues like policy and institutions, they deal with processes such as consultation or decision-making, and they also really try to look at the reshaping of different power relations, but doing that in its inclusive form. So, transforming water resource to deliver water and inclusive development solutions is one of the aspirations of the Sustainable Mekong Research Network, which is SUMERNET, which is what I've just been giving you an illustration of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonie. That was fascinating, and it really kind of highlights also the importance, if you like, of different types of knowledge within transformative processes and transformative water governance, and the fact that SUMERNET has kind of hardwired that in at the beginning is so important, so critical. Yeah. I'm struck by, you know, the challenges that have been raised earlier, governance, that kind of thing. I mean, how does, you know, I want to pose a question, if I may. How do the issues of you know, the idea of sanctioned discourse, you know, what is knowledge that is allowed to be shared and used, and what is more contentious knowledge? How does that raise its ugly head in SUMERNET, and how do you deal with that?
Look, I think it's a great question, and our other 2 case studies I think can jump in as well. But in SUMERNET, I would not say that this need for asking our water researchers to look at human rights or conflict or gender is smooth. It's not easy. It's not part of their general remit. And so I'll come back to your point, but the fact is that this idea about growth actually requires things to be done differently. I mean, that is what transformation is. It's about doing things differently. So we have collaborative research teams that have not worked before. Previously, they've not worked before. So they need to be, you know, storming and norming teams as well as delivering research on the ground, which we know is a really challenging space to be. And the concept that my social knowledge is that as valuable as your infrastructure knowledge or your hydrological knowledge. And that's a really, you can feel that in the teams. There's tension, there's conflict, but there's also, because they're research, you know, there's clear outputs. We're after journal articles, we're after on-ground policy action. So sometimes the knowledge is divided. Sometimes it's valued in different ways for different types of outputs. So I guess there's no one size fits all.
Thank you. Really, a really interesting response. And I wanted to, you know, again, your approach could be replicated elsewhere outside the Mekong, of course. And there's a question to Jonathan, in fact, about this sort of, you know, for want of a better word, scaling up of these kind of transformative approaches in other places. So the question to you, Jonathan, is is from Antoinette Salah. What lessons can other African river basin authorities learn from that case study in the Incomati? Is it working for the communities who use the water for their livelihood? So, you know, is it scalable? Is it replicable, that experience in the Incomati? And how important is it for the realities of lived experience and livelihoods in the communities of the basin?
Yeah, thanks, Alan and Antoinette. Good question. And you know, the word scale, it's interesting when you're talking about scaling to other areas. You know, I often think of scale in a different way. They're both valid, but I mean, when you're talking about the scale of Incomati, as I think I flagged in the presentation, it's very small. And I think some of the successes that I often find in transboundary water management or governance of transboundary watercourses, they're often at a small scale because they connect better. So it's far easier to do that when things are so local. Some of the other, I'm not going to really go on a laundry list of other basins where I view governance to be successful, but they're often small. And I think what happens when you zoom out and look at some of the bigger basins is transboundary water governance and management becomes a little bit disconnected from those local realities. So, and how to bridge that, I often think one way to do that is to look at managing water in subbasins, transboundary subbasins within broader basins, or other colleagues of IMI and myself have worked together on transboundary aquifers, which tend to be more local in scale. But starting small, finding ways to connect what are often quite large shared basins that have important implications for the local level, but connecting that to the more local level is key, and it's not straightforward. And I think, to be honest, a lot of management and governance efforts in shared water courses have struggled to make that leap to this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. A question for you, Leonie, from Fazilda Nabil. What implementation challenges do you face in your efforts at collecting local knowledge in the SUMERNET project? I guess
great question.
Fazilda, you're referring there to sort of operational challenges or questions of the complexities of talking to different kinds of communities. But anyway, over to you, Leonie.
Okay, I think I was going down the same line as you, Alan. My question was, what is local? I mean, local for one group, for one local community is actually, way too scaled up or scaled out or temporally not specific. With the SUMERNET program, I'm the coordinator for the research for policy and practice, which means that I work with our project leaders. And so we have a dialogue about the type of data they're collecting, and we're certainly available in the Secretariat to support them, and we provide capacity building, we provide training, and we're available for discussions as well. But when we talk about us collecting local data, I think that that's a misnomer, because it's the projects and project leaders on the ground. And here we've also got the strength of having one of our project leaders here, because Diana is one of those. And so I think we can throw over to her, but I would again say that this local concept is very specific to that project and also to the types of people they're trying to engage. And for some of them, it's been a real challenge, if I can be very honest, about how they had to collect data that was outside their comfort zone. And not only that, but how do you analyze that data? Like, what is the legitimacy? So we've got an ethics process that's been put in place that for some researchers, first time they've ever done it. And the legitimacy of how they collect that, store that data, and then what they can actually do with it at the end. Lots of challenges, but we're seeing lots of progress and lots of opportunities going forward about how they're really integrating these types of data, particularly around gender and around minority ethnic groups within their water decision-making processes, and hence within the wider structure of water governance. So I think it's really great to see. It's really, really positive outcomes.
Fascinating. And Diana, then, as a project leader in one of the SUMERNET projects, how would you, interpret the challenge posed by Fazilda in your context in Myanmar, for example, and the challenge of collecting local knowledge?
Yeah, I think in Myanmar itself, I think both for Myanmar and Laos, I think the challenge is to really also be aware of your role as a researcher, because I think situation can be intense, and of course everyone is biased, and you have your preferences to favor certain outcomes, to favor certain process. But I think the most important thing is to tell yourself that you are not an actor here, or if you are an actor, that's not the type of role that you are going to play in terms of like become a player yourself. You are more of a facilitator. You are more of so you have to make that boundary very clear also for yourself from the start. Even you want to cross that during the process, you have to realize that that would be not ethical, because it will hurt someone else's trust. It will also kind of give a threat. I mean, ethically, it is just not acceptable, I think, to use the information you have collected to kind of use it in the way that will affect certain groups better than the other, especially when local communities are competing with each other. Yeah. So I think that's more of an ethical notion, that you need to be aware that you should not cross that line.
Yeah. And linked to that, I suppose, is this point that David's raised about recognizing communities as their own experts, in a sense. And there's a need to help ensure that, you know, they're a resource to be able to engage as partners in water governance processes, rather than just kind of recipients of benefits down the line. So, you know, it's again, it's about this agency issue, isn't it? About individuals and communities as agents of their own destinies and futures and development pathways, etc. And so, and knowledge is key. Shared knowledge as part of collective action is key. But how do you, you know, how do you bring the knowledge, or how do you bring the individuals with their knowledge into these processes of change? Is, you know, you've done the board game is one example, but are there other ways, do you think, Diana?
What we, I mean, in Myanmar, the board game is one of the example, but in Laos, for the SUMERNET project, for instance, that IMI leads, we work closely with local communities, but we haven't done the board game scenario at all, but more in terms of asking critical questions. So rather than like telling them like, this is what you should do, don't you think you should do this? We are asking critical question in terms of, okay, you agree to be resettled, and how do you want to do, how do you view the resettlement process going? What is your view, and do you see your future as something that you will be forward looking, or, you know? So I mean, asking those questions is, I think, also important, because sometimes people just assume that that they will get it later, or they will not get it, or, I mean, opening that question and also ensuring that negotiation is possible.
Yeah,
I think that is key.
excellent. And we're coming to the end now, so we need to wrap up. I want to thank the presenters, Mark Smith as well, of course, at the head of the meeting, and I want to thank the people who've posed questions, very useful questions. And I think this whole agenda of transformative water governance has a long way to go. We still have much to do to frame effectively the ideas and their relevance and their importance in this current context, not just geographies we've looked at, but wider geographies too. Particularly as we march towards this sort of big UN meeting in 2023, it'd be very useful to frame this effectively. And I would encourage from IMI's side, all of us, to continue some kind of community of practice, or something that will enable us to stay active in thinking through these ideas. So with further ado, I want to hand over to, without further ado, hand over to Leonie to frame some final thoughts for the meeting. Leonie, over to you.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. I agree. I feel like we're just touching the surface here. We talked about political spaces in which we could agree to or create transformative water governance. Now, when we talk about these sorts of things, it's not about a one perspective that's got the answer. It's about actually all of us working together. And as such, I feel that today we've touched on a couple of case studies, a couple of examples. Alan started us off with a framework that frankly had a lot of words and a lot of ideas in it. And I think it really needs a bit more testing out. And I think the work and the questions that we've had today is a really good start for actually doing that. And I'd like to welcome everyone to actually join with us and see if we can move this discussion further. Let's get past just this single session at SIWI and try to do something a bit more than this. If everyone's okay with it, we'd like to grab your names, if that's possible, and we'd like to invite you to start perhaps off a bit of an email discussion about how we can move transformative water governance that actually is more inclusive from wider perspectives. With that, I'd like to thank both IMI and SEI for sponsoring this event, for getting us to start the dialogue. I'd like to thank Mark, Alan, Diana, Jonathan, all of us for our time and presentations. And most importantly, at the end, I'd like to thank everyone that's online. We really value your time, and that you chose to have it with us and to ask some critical questions means that I think we're all in the same space. So with that, I'd like to say thanks to everyone. Enjoy the day, night, evening, afternoon, and I look forward to hearing more and talking more about transformative water governance.
Thank you, Leonie. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day or evening.